A widow kept the lighthouse lit for 20 years. Then a buyer sent men to take it from her. Briar Holt had $11, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job, maintaining aids to navigation along a stretch of coast 2 states south, and a habit of following any coastline she crossed until she found the nearest lighthouse, a habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her fed and sheltered for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier when the Coast Guard contractor that employed her lost its regional maintenance contract to a cheaper competitor, eliminating her position along with a dozen others in a single round of layoffs. She had been moving down the coast ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The layoff notice had cited contract restructuring as its cause, language Briar had learned across 8 months of towns exactly like this one, to recognize as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular stretch of coast and its specific navigational hazards mattered less than whichever bidder could offer the lowest price on paper. She had grown up the daughter of a lighthouse keeper herself, one of the last generation to hold that title before automation replaced nearly every keeper along this coast. And she had learned, from childhood, a particular reverence for the specific discipline of tending a light faithfully night after night, for people who would never know the keeper's name, but depended on the beam regardless. She found Cormorant Point Light on a foggy autumn evening, a white masonry tower rising 80 feet above a rocky headland, its lantern room burning steady and bright, despite a small automated beacon mounted on a pole beside it that suggested the tower itself had been officially decommissioned years earlier. Briar stood at the base a long while, studying the light's clean, well-maintained beam, noting the particular quality of the lens's rotation, the smooth, unhurried sweep of a mechanism that had clearly been cared for with real devotion rather than merely left running by accident, before an elderly woman emerged from a small keeper's cottage adjoining the tower, drawn outside by the sound of Briar's approach along the gravel path. "You're not from around here," the woman said, studying Briar with the particular directness of someone long accustomed to strangers wandering up to her lighthouse out of curiosity. "Most visitors don't come this late in the day. Name's Agnes Winthrop. I've kept this light burning for 20 years now, ever since my husband Thomas passed. What brings you out this way?" "I used to work aids to navigation maintenance," Briar said. "I saw the light from the road and wanted to see it up close. I didn't expect to find it still active, given the automated beacon standing right beside it. The Coast Guard decommissioned the original lens back when Thomas was still keeper," Agnes said. "Replaced it with that automated blinker you're looking at. Told him the light itself wasn't needed anymore, technically speaking. Thomas kept the original lamp running anyway, every night until the day he died, and I've kept it running every night since, because I don't believe a light this many ships have depended on over the decades ever stops mattering just because a piece of paper says it's redundant." "That's a considerable commitment," Briar said. 20 years alone, maintaining a system most people would have simply let go dark." "It never once felt like a burden," Agnes said. "It felt like the one thing I could still do for Thomas, every single night, long after I could no longer do anything else for him at all. I used to climb these same stairs when he was still keeper, watching him work the mechanism with a patience I never quite managed myself. I think tending it now is my own way of still climbing those stairs beside him, even 20 years after he stopped needing my company on the way up." Over the following days, as Briar found temporary work in the nearby village and returned each evening to help Agnes with small maintenance tasks around the tower, Agnes told her, in pieces, the fuller history of her 20 years tending a light the government considered obsolete. Thomas Winthrop had served as the lighthouse's official keeper for over 3 decades before his death, and had continued maintaining the original lens and lamp mechanism personally even after the Coast Guard's official decommissioning. an arrangement the regional Coast Guard commander at the time had apparently tolerated informally, understanding the value local mariners still placed on the tower's stronger, more penetrating beam, compared to the automated beacon's weaker light. When Thomas died, Agnes had simply continued the tradition, maintaining the tower and its historic lens through her own determination and a small pension that barely covered the property's basic upkeep. Thomas used to say the automated beacon was fine for a clear night, when a captain barely needed any light at all to find his way. Agnes told Briar one evening, the two of them sitting in the keeper's cottage while rain tapped steadily against the windows. It was the bad nights, the fog and the storms, when the old lens's stronger beam actually mattered. He couldn't in good conscience let that beam go dark on the exact nights it was needed most, whatever the Coast Guard's own budget decided about redundancy. "I don't actually own this land, not properly," Agnes admitted one evening as she and Briar sat together in the keeper's cottage. The property reverted to federal ownership when the Coast Guard decommissioned the station. "I've simply lived here these 20 years because nobody with any authority ever told me to leave, and because Thomas's old commanding officer, before he retired himself, gave me his word that I'd always have a home here for as long as I wanted one." "Was that word ever put in writing?" Briar asked. "I don't believe so," Agnes said. "It was simply a promise, made by a decent man who understood what this light meant to Thomas and to me both. I never thought to ask for anything more formal, because I never imagined the federal government would eventually sell this property to someone who might actually want me gone. Promises like that rarely survive a change of ownership," Briar said gently. "Not because they weren't genuine, but because the next person holding the deed never heard them made, and has no particular reason to honor a stranger's word." "I understand that now," Agnes said. "I don't think I understood it 20 years ago, when the commander gave me his word and I simply trusted it the way I trusted Thomas himself." She looked out the cottage window toward the tower, its beam already beginning its evening sweep against the gathering dusk. "I suppose that's the particular danger of trusting good men entirely. You forget that the world eventually replaces them with people who never knew them at all, and owe you nothing beyond what you can actually prove." Briar spent the following weeks doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She looked at what the lighthouse and its historic lens mechanism actually needed, and made herself useful, understanding that whatever legal uncertainty surrounded Agnes's tenure here, the light itself deserved the same careful attention it had always received. The lens's rotation mechanism, still functioning after decades but showing signs of wear in its bearing assembly, benefited from a careful cleaning and relubrication Briar performed over several patient days, and she repaired a section of the lantern room's glazing where age had let a small gap develop, work that improved the light's overall performance in ways even Agnes, after 20 years of tending it herself, noticed immediately. Briar also serviced the lamp's own fuel supply system, cleaning years of accumulated sediment from lines that had never been professionally inspected since Thomas's death, work that reduced the risk of a sudden failure at exactly the wrong moment. She spent a full week testing the lens's clockwork weight system, the mechanism that turned the whole apparatus at its precise, steady rate, discovering a slight irregularity in the rotation speed that she traced eventually to a worn gear tooth deep within the mechanism. Rather than risk further damage attempting a repair beyond her own tool's capability, she sourced a replacement gear through a specialty supplier, who still served the handful of historic lighthouses along the coast, paying for it with wages from her temporary village work, understanding that a light this significant deserved a repair done properly rather than a quick fix that might fail at the worst possible moment. "You've a proper feel for this work," Agnes told her, watching Briar adjust the lens's rotation speed with small, careful movements. Thomas had that same touch. Some people can follow a manual step by step and still never quite understand what a mechanism actually needs. You clearly understand it the way he did. It was in a small filing cabinet in the keeper's cottage. While helping Agnes organize decades of accumulated paperwork one rainy afternoon, that Briar found a folder containing correspondence between Thomas Winthrop and the regional Coast Guard commander from the year of decommissioning, correspondence that included a formal, if informally worded letter Agnes had apparently never fully read or understood the significance of. The folder held years of routine maintenance logs and inspection reports alongside the more significant letter, and Briar worked through the whole collection methodically, understanding that context mattered as much as the letter itself, in establishing exactly what arrangement Thomas and the commander had actually reached. The letter, signed by the commander himself, acknowledged Thomas's continued voluntary maintenance of the historic lens, and granted him, in writing, what the letter called informal keeper status, for as long as he or his surviving spouse wished to maintain the light, a designation that, while not a formal property deed, constituted a documented federal acknowledgment of an ongoing arrangement that a subsequent property sale might not have properly accounted for. I don't understand why Thomas never mentioned this letter existed, Agnes said, reading it for what she admitted was likely the first time in 20 years, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the commander's signature at the bottom of the page. I remember the commander visiting, remember him and Thomas talking privately more than once, but I never knew there was anything in writing about it. Perhaps Thomas simply never thought he'd need it, Briar said. 20 years is a long time to hold on to a document nobody ever asked to see. I imagine it felt, for most of that time, like an old formality rather than something that might one day matter enormously. He was never a man who worried much about the future, Agnes said, a small fond smile crossing her tired face despite the circumstances. I used to tease him that he lived entirely in whatever night's weather the light needed to answer, and gave very little thought to anything beyond it. I suppose this letter is proof that some small part of him did think ahead, even if he never told me so directly. This might not settle the property question outright, Briar said, but it's exactly the kind of document an attorney could use to argue you have a legitimate, documented claim to remain here, regardless of who currently holds the deed. I think it's worth having someone qualified look at it properly. I don't have money for an attorney, Agnes admitted. I've managed 20 years on a small pension and whatever the Historical Society occasionally sends for maintenance supplies. I don't know how I'd afford to properly defend a claim like this. Let's find out what options actually exist before we assume there aren't any, Briar said. I don't think a document this significant should simply sit in a drawer because neither of us yet knows who might be willing to help. Briar spent the following days making calls from the village's public library, eventually reaching a regional maritime historical preservation society that maintained records on decommissioned lighthouses across the entire coast, and found, once she explained Cormorant Point's specific circumstances, an organization considerably more interested in the case than she'd initially dared hope. We've been trying for years to formally document informal keeper arrangements like the one you're describing, a society representative named Eleanor Vance told her, over the phone. Most of them are lost entirely once the original keeper passes, the paperwork scattered or discarded by relatives who don't understand its significance. A case with a properly signed letter still intact, and a keeper's widow still actively maintaining the light 20 years later. That's precisely the kind of documentation we need to make a broader case for protecting these arrangements across the whole coast. Would the society be willing to help Mrs. Winthrop directly? Briar asked. I'd want to see the letter myself first, Eleanor said, but based on what you've described, I don't see why we wouldn't. We maintain a small legal fund specifically for cases like this one. It's rare we get the chance to use it on a case this clearly documented. She paused. Most keepers who maintained a light past its official decommissioning never thought to ask for anything in writing at all. Whoever this commander was, he did Mrs. Winthrop an enormous kindness, whether he fully understood it at the time or not. Julian Prescott arrived at Cormorant Point 3 weeks later, stepping out of a car considerably nicer than anything else that had driven up the lighthouse's gravel access road in years, accompanied by 2 men whose purpose Briar understood immediately from their bearing alone. "Mrs. Winthrop," Prescott said with a practiced smoothness that struck Briar as considerably too polished for the circumstances. "I purchased this property at a federal surplus auction 2 months ago. I'm afraid you've been occupying it without proper authorization, and I'll need you to vacate within the week. I've brought some assistance today to begin the process of clearing the property for the renovation I've planned." "What sort of renovation?" Agnes asked. "A private residence," Prescott said. "This headland's views are considerably wasted on a functioning lighthouse nobody official even requires anymore. I intend to convert the tower and cottage both into something the location actually deserves. I've kept this light burning for 20 years, Agnes said, with a steadiness that Briar had come to recognize as the particular calm of someone who had faced down worse fears than a stranger's polished threats. "I have documentation of an arrangement with the Coast Guard predating your purchase by decades. I don't believe you have the authority to simply remove me without addressing that arrangement properly first. Whatever informal understanding you had with a Coast Guard officer decades ago has no bearing on a federal auction's legal transfer of title," Prescott said. "I purchased this property free and clear. I'm not obligated to honor arrangements that were never properly recorded against the deed." "The letter isn't merely an informal understanding," Briar said, stepping forward. "It's a signed official acknowledgement from the commanding officer of this station, granting continued keeper status. I'd think a federal auctions legal team would want to review that before assuming the property transferred entirely free of any prior claims." Prescott's practiced smoothness flickered, just slightly, replaced by something more calculating. "And who are you?" he asked. "Someone who understands aids to navigation maintenance well enough to know exactly what this light's actual value is," Briar said, "and someone who's read the letter in question closely enough to know it's worth considerably more legal weight than you're currently giving it credit for." "I'll have my own attorneys review whatever document you're describing," Prescott said. "In the meantime, I'd advise you both to begin making arrangements, because I don't intend to let a decades-old letter delay a renovation I've already invested considerable resources into planning." He left with his 2 men, though Briar understood, watching them go, that Prescott's confidence had been shaken more than his composed exit suggested. The 2 men themselves, Briar noticed, had said nothing throughout the entire exchange, standing near the car with the particular idle patience of hired muscle waiting for a signal that, in this instance, never came. And she found herself wondering, watching their truck disappear down the gravel road, how many other properties those same 2 men had helped clear of occupants with rather less documentation to defend themselves than Agnes now possessed. Word of Prescott's visit reached the nearby village within days, the way news traveled quickly along any stretch of close-knit coastline, carried from the harbor to the general store to the diner counter, with the particular efficiency small towns reserved for exactly this kind of shared concern. And it was the local harbor master, a weathered man named Otis Kane, who had known Agnes for decades, who first offered to help however he could. Half the captains working this stretch of coast owe that light more than they'll ever properly say out loud, Otis told Briar, at the village dock where she'd taken temporary work, helping with boat maintenance while she settled into her new circumstances. "I've heard Prescott's story about an undervalued property. I don't think he understood, buying it sight unseen at auction, exactly what he was actually purchasing, or exactly how many people in this village would have something to say about it once word got around." "Do you think that matters, practically speaking?" Briar asked. "Public opinion doesn't necessarily change what a deed says." "Maybe not directly," Otis said, "but public opinion has a way of making a man's renovation permits considerably harder to secure, and his contractors considerably less willing to take his calls, once word spreads that half a village considers his project an insult to something they all depend on. I don't think Julian Prescott fully appreciates yet how small towns handle exactly this kind of dispute." He paused, considering his own words a moment longer. "We don't forget easily out here, whoever's holding the deed. This coast has a longer memory than any single owner's paperwork." The fog rolled in 3 nights later, thicker than Cormorant Point had seen in years, exactly the kind of dense coastal fog that rendered the automated beacon's weaker light nearly useless, while the historic lens's stronger, more penetrating beam continued cutting through the murk with considerably greater effectiveness. Briar had spent the preceding days running the lens through additional test cycles, some instinct telling her the season's first real fog bank would test the mechanism harder than any routine maintenance check could anticipate, and she was glad, watching the fog thicken that evening, that she'd trusted the instinct. It was during that same fog that a fishing vessel, its captain unfamiliar with these waters and relying on the automated beacon alone for reference, found itself dangerously close to the rocky shoal below the point, saved only when the crew spotted the historic lens's stronger beam and used it to correct their bearing before running aground entirely. Agnes and Briar stood together at the tower's base that night, listening to the distant sound of the vessel's engine straining against a current that had nearly carried it onto the rocks, both women holding their breath until the sound finally faded safely toward the harbor. "That's precisely why Thomas never let this light go dark," Agnes said, once the danger had clearly passed. 20 years, and it still does exactly what it was always meant to do. The one night a season when it actually matters more than any automated system ever could. The vessel's captain, once safely into harbor, told the story to anyone who would listen, and word of the near disaster reached the regional newspaper within days, prompting a reporter named Delia Marsh to visit Cormorant Point herself and interview both Agnes and, once she learned of the story's growing public interest, Julian Prescott as well. "You're planning to demolish or convert the very structure that just prevented a fishing vessel from running aground?" the reporter asked Prescott, during a call Briar happened to overhear from the cottage's open window. "I'd like to understand how that squares with your renovation plans, and with the 20-year-old federal letter Mrs. Winthrop's attorney has apparently now formally submitted to your legal team." Prescott's answer, when it came, carried none of the smooth confidence he'd shown at his first visit to the property. "My renovation plans remain under review," he said, a phrase Delia Marsh's eventual article characterized as considerably more evasive than anything a man confident in his legal position would typically offer a reporter. Prescott's renovation plans, once the newspaper article ran alongside a photograph of the fishing vessel's grateful captain, drew considerably more public scrutiny than he had evidently anticipated when he'd first purchased what he'd assumed was simply an empty, undervalued piece of coastal property. Prescott's renovation plans, once the newspaper article ran alongside a photograph of the fishing vessel's grateful captain, drew considerably more public scrutiny than he had evidently anticipated when he'd first purchased what he'd assumed was simply an empty, undervalued piece of coastal property. Letters to the newspaper's editor followed within the week, several from mariners describing their own close calls along that same stretch of coast, and a state representative from the district issued a public statement questioning whether the federal auction process had adequately considered the property's ongoing maritime safety value before listing it for private sale. Agnes's attorney, a careful man Briar had helped her retain through a maritime historical preservation society that took an immediate interest in the case once the newspaper story broke, negotiated a settlement within the following month that granted Agnes a formal, permanent life estate in the keeper's cottage and continued access to maintain the historic lens, in exchange for Agnes formally relinquishing any broader claim to the surrounding property Prescott intended to develop. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Foster Cray, whose name Briar recognized from stories she'd heard traveling through other coastal counties, explained the settlement's terms carefully to both women before either signed anything. This protects exactly what matters most to you, Cray told Agnes. Your home and your ability to keep tending this light, without requiring a protracted legal battle over the surrounding property that could have dragged on for years with an uncertain outcome. I think it's the wisest resolution available, given everything at stake. I never wanted the whole property, Agnes told Briar, once the settlement was finalized. I only ever wanted to keep tending this light, the way Thomas always did, for as long as I'm able. I think Julian Prescott finally understood that once the newspaper made it considerably harder for him to simply erase 20 years of a promise nobody bothered writing down properly the first time. Prescott ultimately scaled back his renovation plans considerably, developing only the portion of the headland furthest from the tower itself and the Maritime Historical Preservation Society that had helped negotiate Agnes's settlement formally recognized Cormorant Point Light as a protected historic maritime structure, ensuring no future property owner could attempt the same removal Prescott had once considered a straightforward business decision. Eleanor Vance visited the lighthouse herself once the designation was finalized, walking the tower's spiral stairs with evident satisfaction at seeing the historic lens still turning steadily overhead. This is exactly the kind of outcome our society exists to help secure, she told Briar and Agnes both. 20 years of quiet devotion, nearly erased by a single auction listing that never once considered what it was actually selling. I'm glad we could help make certain that particular mistake doesn't repeat itself here again. I'd like to help with other cases like this one if the society ever needs it, Briar offered. I understand this kind of mechanical work well enough that I imagine I could be useful documenting other lights in similar situations. I may well take you up on that, Eleanor said. There aren't many people left who understand these old mechanisms properly, and fewer still willing to fight this hard on behalf of a light nobody official considers necessary anymore. Briar stayed on at Cormorant Point through that winter, and the ones that followed, formally hired by the Maritime Historical Society that had helped negotiate Agnes's settlement to serve as the light's official caretaker, a position that finally gave both women legal standing to keep the historic lens burning for as long as ship still found its stronger beam worth watching for. Through a fog, the automated beacon alone could never fully answer. The Society's formal recognition came with a modest annual stipend for the light's continued maintenance, considerably more security than Agnes had known in the 20 years since Thomas's death. And Briar found herself watching Agnes's shoulders visibly ease under the weight of that security, glad to have played some part in finally making an informal promise into something considerably harder to take away. Thomas would have been glad to know this light outlasted every attempt to call it unnecessary. Agnes told Briar, one clear evening, watching the beam sweep steadily across calm water. 20 years, and it still does exactly what he always believed it should. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the light, Briar said. I think he'd have been glad you never had to face any of this entirely alone. Agnes was quiet a moment, watching the beam's steady rotation. I didn't expect, at my age, to find myself grateful for a stranger climbing up my gravel path on a foggy evening, she said. But I am, considerably more than I know how to properly express. You gave an old woman's 20 years of quiet devotion the kind of protection it always deserved and never had, until you happened to notice a light burning where the paperwork said it shouldn't be. I think I noticed it because some part of me was looking for exactly this kind of place, Briar said. A light somebody actually cared enough about to keep burning past the point any one official required it. I didn't know I was looking for that until I found it. Then I suppose we found each other at exactly the right moment, Agnes said. Whatever the paperwork ever tried to say about timing, that wasn't ours to control. Briar wrote to her own mother that winter, describing the lighthouse and the settlement and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine coastal walk to become, in the end, Exactly the kind of steady work and purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the contract loss ended her own position. Her mother's reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Briar remembered growing up with. Your grandfather kept a light on this same coast for 30 years and always said the job wasn't really about the bulb or the lens. It was about being the one person willing to show up every single night for people who'd never know your name. Sounds like you found your way back to exactly that kind of work and exactly the kind of person who needed you to. Briar thought, some evenings that winter, about the 8 months of towns and contract losses that had led her to a foggy gravel path outside a keeper's cottage, and understood, watching Agnes move through her daily rituals with a security she hadn't known in 20 years, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own grandfather had modeled decades before she was ever born. Not simply a job maintaining a mechanism, but a commitment to showing up faithfully for people who would never know her name. The same commitment that had kept a widow climbing a lighthouse tower every single night for 2 decades. Long after any one official had decided it was necessary. Otis Kane stopped by the lighthouse more than once that winter as well, bringing supplies from the village and sharing, over evenings by the cottage's small fire, stories of the coast's long maritime history that Briar found herself absorbing with the same hungry attention she'd once brought to her father's own service calls as a child. This whole stretch of coast has a long memory, Otis told her one evening. Ships that made it home because somebody kept a light burning through weather that should have kept them wrecked. Agnes Winthrop's just the latest name on a list considerably longer than either of us could count properly. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many quiet promises, made in good faith and never properly written down, end up tested decades later by someone who never knew or cared that the promise existed at all? And what does it take? A stranger who understood the mechanism well enough to keep it running, a forgotten letter, a fog thick enough to prove what a piece of paper alone never could, for 20 years of quiet devotion to finally be protected properly? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.